For 2 well-remembered years, I got to see how some people live in a boarding school. I went to a reunion and saw what had changed. Ah, the old bottom corridor. Cockroach infested at night, those doors would shut automatically during the 3 or 4 daily false fire alarms. Good Lord, they still had exactly the same photographs of old school plays on the walls. They were old even in my day.
It's not easy to describe my feelings on coming back here. It's easier for me to do it this time. This is not my first reunion. When I left here as a pupil, I felt like coming back and levelling the place. I felt the walls of the school closing in on me, and I didn't like it and was quite glad to escape. I certainly, when I went to university, was a great deal happier than I ever was here. But things weren't so bad here in other ways. I mean, I got an awful lot done. I used to draw loads of pictures, and I appeared in loads of plays, and I did assemblies and so forth. The things that it was possible to do here if you had a bit of initiative, well, yeah, quite good. Of course, not everyone had huge amounts of initiative.
When I was a pupil, you had to be fairly comfortably off to afford sending your children here. But these days, well, are you sitting down? Good. And if you're eating, then I'd advise that you chew and swallow now, because I don't want you to choke. It costs a mind-melting £36,000 per child per year. Yes, not many pairs of twins here.
One thing you could do here was book the morning assembly. 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, the whole school would meet in the Code Hall, which is like the theatre stroke assembly room, and there would be an assembly, and of course very often assembly is the headmaster talking to the house or whatever, but it was possible for pupils to book these morning assemblies. And so I did this a number of times, sometimes on my own, sometimes with friends. I also got roped into a lot of stuff which perhaps I shouldn't have allowed myself to be roped into, but it's quite a thing, really, that pupils can book such a public forum. Although I did get into trouble when apparently misusing the 24-hour board. There was a board called the 24-hour board, and the rule was that if a notice had been on that for a day and you didn't see it, well, then that was your fault. And again, punishments abounded. So I just took one look at this and thought, wow, that's a fantastic forum. I can make use of that, and I started putting my own notices on. And I got into a bit of trouble for this, but I didn't get punished because there wasn't actually a rule against that, because incredibly they hadn't thought that anyone would do it. And it amazed me. I thought, well, surely that's one of the first things that anyone's going to do. You stick any note on this board and everybody in the school within one day will have seen it. Anyway, so I was a bit of a weird case. Sometimes today, for instance, the teachers have described me as a rebel when I was here. I don't really think I was a rebel, in that I didn't really break any of the rules. I was quite actually uncommonly rule-abiding, but I didn't rebel according to the rules. You see, what you were supposed to do when you were a rebel was smoke, for instance. So a lot of kids would disappear off and smoke, because smoking was something you weren't allowed to do, and there were teachers constantly on patrol to catch smokers. So really, the smokers weren't rebelling at all. They were just playing the game. It was written into the rules. So what I did wasn't exactly rebelling, because I was doing stuff that there weren't rules against. So that's not really rebelling, is it? But it wasn't playing the game. And when I left here, my housemaster gave me a reference, which, to paraphrase it, said, quite nice, but not one of us.
One thing we realised at the reunion is that almost none of the people in my year could afford to send our children here. So, in that measure, the school had failed us, although its ethos is supposedly to turn out happy, rounded people rather than rich ones, and in that regard it may have done better than most boarding schools.
The ethos of the school in the 1920s was very different. The kids wore shorts back then. It was an all-boys school. They did pioneering. That's when they built the Greek theatre, for instance. And one of the things they did was one of the early experiments in trying to move very large stones, such as those at Stonehenge, over land using rollers and so forth. And that pioneering spirit also infected the way they taught. Pupils were given assignments rather than formal lessons, and they were left to get on with it. And in the original days, you could, if you wanted to work at 3 o'clock in the morning, work at 3 o'clock in the morning. Those freedoms had unfortunately been curtailed by the time I got here. I suppose it was trying to be more conventional in order to compete with schools like Rugby and Harrow.
One sinister change was that they now had retina scanners, would you believe, as part of the 24-hour security, with guards and everything. Apparently this was to stop people kidnapping the children of Russian oligarchs.
Yeah, that's where the sign saying you were not allowed to go up these stairs used to be. One thing British public schools are famous for is bullying. But I can report that at least while I was here, there was very little of it. I was here when I was 16 and 17, mind, so perhaps I was too old to be bullied much. But I think the main reason that people didn't bully each other was because you had to live with these people. You couldn't really be terribly nasty to anyone because you had to live with them. And when you're in a boarding school, there's a very claustrophobic atmosphere. There were 600 pupils here and they were my entire world. If I upset a lot of people, those people probably have friends, and I would make life very, very difficult for myself. So there were no fights. The whole time I was here, there were no fights, which I found pretty extraordinary because the school I came from, there were fights every day.
One drawback of going to a public boarding school in the early 20th century was that you were enormously more likely to end up with your name carved on a war memorial. All these schools have one of these. I couldn't help looking up this name, Alastair, Duke of Connaught, Earl of Macduff. Turns out he died on active service after falling out of a window in Canada while drunk and dying of exposure. I'm not sure that counts. A record-breaking avenue of plane trees. There was a rowing competition on. Even the dogs look posh. I was put down to do rowing because the alternative was being flattened 3 times a week on the rugby field. The boat club now has its own flag. I recall being asked to contribute to the fund for the new boathouse. It wasn't my highest spending priority. The shed they had before did the job. Someone said that there were more tennis courts here than in most London boroughs.
There was an institution here called Free Tea, which happened at, 4 or 5 o'clock. So called because presumably they used to charge for it. Anyway, the kids would get their tea and biscuits and so forth, and the queuing discipline was absolutely abysmal. I was pushing and shoving, and generally I didn't bother with it, largely because, of course, I don't drink tea. I know, I'm British, but I don't drink tea. Anyway, when it was my turn, my one, I think, turn to organise the queue for this as a prefect of sorts, I decided to be really efficient, and I set up lots of tables, forcing people to walk between the tables and the serving hatches, and so they could not push and shove. It had to be single file. Anyway, in walked a boy called Ix, and he was the coolest boy in the school. My word, he was so cool. And of course, well, he wasn't going to queue in an orderly fashion. He wanted to push into the front like a cool guy would, right? And he was quite surprised, I think, when I grabbed him as he tried to climb over the tables and physically threw him off them. And rather than then joining the orderly queue, he left, and he did not come back because he was far too embarrassed. That's one of the things you see with cool people. They're very embarrassable. Gotta go. Bye.